everybody. I'm Jeanna Matthews, and this is Matt Gertzen and Joan Donovan. We are, among other things, members of the media manipulation team at Data and Society, and we are thrilled to be here talking about what appears to be a very timely topic, trolling, free speech, and the hacking of our media and attention landscape. So, we're going to advance the slides.
Pardon me?
You're going to advance the slides,
yeah.
Yes? Perfect, awesome. Okay, so to start us out, let's just get on the same page about a little bit about what trolling activities are. Initially, the term was about a mode of baiting other users on Usenet, but it has evolved quite a bit since then. Image board users rating for lulls, drawing attention to activist causes, network harassment and abuse, using controversy to sow chaos and amplify disinformation, baiting journalists into reporting false information. And when we had envisioned doing a little bit of a temperature of the crowd, but it's hard to see who's all out there. I'm still going to give it a little bit of a try. When you think about trolling, do you think about it as a way of pointing out incompetence, kind of an emperor has no clothes in an unjust world? Or do you think about it as this is why we can't have nice things, you're ruining it for us all, kind of way? So I'm going to try this anyway. How many people say I think about it as calling out incompetence? How many people think about it as this is why we can't have nice things? Okay.
Oh, all my people.
So no matter which of those views you came in with, we are going to hope to leave you with examples of the full range. And because this is a hacker conference, we want to compare trolling to hacking of socio-technical systems. So not just hacking technical systems, but could it be hacking people's attention to set media agenda, direct journalists, and social media users to information that the trolls care about? We're in an interesting media environment right now in which legacy gatekeepers like the media are competing with an emergent class of new gatekeepers, network, social media gatekeepers to direct attention. And we think it's pretty fascinating to think about the range of trolling activity, much like we think about the range of hacking activity, and not that we think that there's some clear definition or hard line, but the range of black hat, gray hat, and white hat. So, for example, what might black hat trolling look like? Pushing a private agenda, which is counter to a target's interest. Definitely non-prescribed engagement, different than the media environment or platform imagined correct use, so to speak. What might gray hat look like? That would still be non-prescribed engagement, but perhaps with a sense of public interest, demonstrating an attack surface, demonstrating a proof of concept, putting pressure on gatekeepers, maybe trolling back, where that trolling includes a moment of revelation for the audience that's watching. And what about white hat trolling? Is that possible? What would it be like to reveal vulnerabilities in socio-technical systems to platforms or media gatekeepers? Could be, right? Maybe doxing the trolls. Working to reduce the attack surface, aligning the system with the intent for that system. Disable the possibility of non-prescribed engagement through research and education. Those are some possibilities. One more, Matt, one more? Right, okay. So now I'm going to hand it over to Matt and then Joan. We're going to talk through some case studies that we hope illustrate some points upon the spectrum that are interesting and will spark some good conversation.
Hey, everyone. So I'm going to try to think about trolling in a bit of an expanded sense, not just thinking about people who harass and abuse, but going back to an earlier form of trolling, which had some component of artistry to it, perhaps. So I'm borrowing here this term, the politics of spectacle, from Gabriella Coleman, who writes about how certain hackers would use trolling techniques to draw media attention to certain issues. So I'm gonna go through a few case studies here, and some of them will be familiar to people here because they're from the they're examples from the hacking world. So the first example comes from a group called the Cult of the Dead Cow, and they were still are a hacking organization that was very much devoted to full practices of full disclosure, trying to get software vendors to correct vulnerabilities in their products that were putting users at risk. So this particular example relates to Microsoft, who had a lot of vulnerabilities in their software at a time when many users were using it. It was the default. And so they developed a software they called Back Orifice, which was a play on Back Office, which was Microsoft's remote administration tool at that time.
You should tell the orifice joke.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, a back orifice is a butthole, I guess.
I mean, don't leave it out. Like, it's 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
We got,
So, yeah. So at the time, I mean, I'm not sure if the Cult of the Dead Cow thought of this as a troll, but in many ways it really was. The product was announced. Well, first off, what it did was it allowed anyone to kind of deliver a Trojan horse virus to someone's computer and then have complete access over their machine. And when they released it, it was framed as by the developer Surdistic as a response to being an overworked systems administrator who was tired of having incompetent users that were unable to use back office correctly. So why not just take matters into your own hands? But of course, what it ended up enabling was a lot of so-called script kiddies or less than talented hackers to run amok on other people's machines. So there's a lot of back and forth between Cult of the Dead Cow and Microsoft, and it drew a lot of media attention to the fact that Microsoft was leaving a lot of vulnerabilities open in their systems. So this is an example of what Bruce Schneier later called security economics, where the idea was to put kind of extrinsic pressure on a vendor to take seriously concerns that hackers have been trying to get them to address for a long time. So it's basically affecting their bottom line. So a more direct link to trolling comes from groups like LulzSec and Anonymous. These were groups that used hacking techniques, but they were also very much coming out of the kind of subcultural trolling communities that were interested in the lulz and laughter at the expense of other people. And one particularly interesting example comes from 2011 when a group called LulzSec found out that a security, or I don't know, calling him a security researcher might be overgenerous, but a fellow named Aaron Barr, who's working for a company called HB Gary, was investigating them and trying to de-anonymize some of the members of LulzSec. And when they found out that this was happening, they decided that they were going to, do a kind of a ruin life campaign on him. So they managed to get into HB Gary's systems. And they found evidence that HB Gary was part of a group of private security companies that were trying to do some less than above ground, potentially legally gray things, and they ended up getting Aaron Barr's docs, going onto his LinkedIn page and other social media, and kind of like parroting him to release the information about himself. And in doing so, they also drew a lot of media attention to the issue of what people have called the security intelligence complex, or this sort of phenomenon where people will leave the public sector or military and then start these kind of shady private intelligence companies that are very difficult to get information on. So in the end, a lot of these hackers went to jail, but I think they kind of kickstarted a lot of inquiry into a subject that we still don't know very much about. A similar case to that was by a hacker named Phineas Fisher in 2015. And he had, or he or she or they, we don't actually really know who Phineas Fisher is. There had been talk in the hacker community for some time that a company called Hacking Team in Italy had been selling surveillance products and things like this to governments with less than impeccable human rights records. And they denied it, but Phineas Fisher decided to get into their system and take a look, and discovered that they were in fact selling their tools to some questionable governments. And he also managed to get the source code for their software, and he gained access to their Twitter account, changed the name from Hacking Team to Hacked Team. And then made this tweet: since we have nothing to hide, we're publishing all our emails, files, and source code, and linked to all of their intellectual property, their emails, and everything, kind of as proof of their wrongdoing, and also really jeopardizing their bottom line by making their software less valuable. And of course, the kind of spectacular way that they did this drew a lot of media attention, and again, resulted in a news cycle that didn't last that long, but increased public attention of some of these issues. So these are just all some examples of what I see as trolling techniques that are being used to kind of increase transparency, draw attention to issues that have been ignored, that we don't know too much about, and kind of funnel attention to some important issues. More recently, just last month, the examples I gave are all of kind of technically minded people, but just last month, an artist installed a sculpture of a spoon in front of Purdue Pharma, which is the company that manufactures OxyContin. And so just by this kind of simple gesture, this artist named Dominic Esposito managed to generate dozens of news stories, reasserting in the media and in the public attention the important issue of the opioid epidemic, and the fact that this company could probably do something to stop it. With that, I will hand it over to Joan, who I think has some less stellar examples of trolling to talk about.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I apologize, I can't see everyone, and so it's going to be hard for me to gauge a reaction. So feel free to shout out, laugh, sigh loudly. It's a shame no one has a hat that got snatched that I could wear, so that I could see you all. Yeah, it was funny. It was a joke, har har. We're dealing with some tough times here. It's not going to be easy, and free speech is definitely something that we have to deal with, both as a defense and as a troll. Because what it ends up getting put on the table, I think, is that we get stuck in the moment of intent, and we get stuck in the moment of values, and then we don't think about each other, how it puts each other on edge, how we make each other feel. In these moments where people are trying to gather attention in order to either promote their own agenda or to really just cause division. And so I tend to study people who like to cause division. And one of the things that I've been focusing my past year of research on is this notion of source hacking, which is a tactic where groups coordinate to feed false information to journalists and experts, usually during times of crisis. So there's a lot of talk about what fake news means and misinformation, disinformation. It was really hilarious in our office when the IRA story broke about the Internet Research Agency in Russia, because what we know about trolling is that you don't need to put everyone in an office building and make them work 9 to 5 to get them to participate in a cause. You just have to make it interesting. You have to gamify it in some way. You have to have some stakes, and you have to want to win. So when I will give you a few examples of what I might consider black hat trolling that is also trolling in the interest of, in these cases, what we colloquially might call the alt-right. But this, I can show you if you ever wanted to see a network map, how this goes straight back to classic examples with David Duke and Stormfront and all of those actual white supremacists who cop to it. And then we can also draw those clear distinctions and not be afraid to call the alt-right actual white supremacists. So the first example that I have relates to the Republic of Florida hoax. One of the things that we have been tracking are groups online that like to coordinate to disrupt journalists and to lace the attention landscape or lace a breaking news story with fake sources. So this hoax was planned in a Discord chat room full of edgelords, actual white supremacists, lulzy folks. You know, they were just like, how much could we disrupt the story? So they planted a photo on 4chan, knowing that every journalist goes to 4chan to try to get a scoop in the moment of a breaking news crisis. And they claimed that Nicholas Cruz was the one in this, in the mask, and he was part of this Republic of Florida hoax. So this became something that the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, tried to prove. But this is kind of a meme within a meme. So the Republic of Florida militia also doesn't really exist, but there is a guy that thinks the Republic of Florida militia exists, and he thinks he's the head of it. And so the ADL called him to verify that Nicholas Cruz was a participant, and of course he did verify that. And once the ADL, as experts, published this information and told journalists it created a news cascade where the entire conversation about Nicholas Cruz that day was that he was a neo-Nazi white supremacist, and that was his intent and his motive for murdering students in Parkland, right? And so this kind of hack puts white supremacist ideas, thoughts, and agendas fully in view, and what it does is it sets a public dialogue where people then have to debate, have to have these conversations, have to focus their attention and focus their emotions on this kind of crisis rather than what we now know is true, is we have a very isolated and violent youth who was deranged. So the next one, it's a little depressing. I'm not gonna lie. The other tactic that we tend to notice is news spamming. So this is a post that was put together. There were several posts being collages being made at the same time on 4chan and 8chan. And the idea in some of the text around these posts was to say, let's get all the information we can on the car attacker in Charlottesville. And there were some people that were very insistent that even with shaky evidence, they should put this information out there. And someone, and you can actually start looking at, you can't see it in this picture, but if you look at the screenshots on the phone, what you end up realizing is that the collage has probably been made by a single person because of the way that the icons and the time and the battery level on the phone are, telling of something. But what's interesting about a spam attack like this is they didn't try to make this image trend, right? It wasn't like they loaded it into a bunch of accounts on Twitter and tried to get everyone to pay attention to this story. Where we saw it was in replies to journalists. Have you seen this? Is this verified? Right? So they were kind of baiting, like Matt has talked about, journalists into verifying this information. And of course, on the message boards, some of the intent was very clear that it couldn't be known that someone related to the alt-right was doing this because that would be bad for the movement. And so blaming this teenager who also happened to have a name that was so unique that in name search, it's one of one. So for a journalist, you can verify the social media account. You can go to Search Query, and if you don't know enough about it, Search Query's information is usually about 2 to 3 years old. And so it did have the right license plate number, but it had the wrong state, and it had the wrong registrant. And so journalists were picking up this story and we're rushing to publish because they're all in a race to the bottom, usually during crisis events. But this young man had to get run out of his house. He was getting doxxed. His family was getting threatened, and the police in his town said, yeah, we can't really protect you because we don't actually know what people are about to do. And so for us, when we start to talk about black hat trolling or hacking with the intention of setting public agendas, what we are trying to understand as a research group is, how do we defend against this? Now, I'm going to turn it over to Jeanna in a minute, who's going to tell us a bit about top-down, middle-up, bottom-up ways of doing this. But I also want to invite everyone in this room, if you have ideas, we're always listening to them. We're always open to this. And to Matt's point about when they're hacking a socio-technical system, it isn't just about being technologically savvy. A lot of this stuff we see is no-tech hacking, right? It's like basic phone phreaking, some phishing, some social engineering, but it isn't really robust in any sophisticated sense. But I want to invite you to email us or to be in touch with us at Data and Society, and let's think about those bottom-up parts of this system so that we can protect communities like you all and protect communities of researchers who are also suffering from, when we uncover these things, unfortunately, we end up getting lots and lots of death threats, et cetera, et cetera. So it behooves us to start working together in a very coordinated fashion.
So we hope that we have convinced you, no matter how you came into this room thinking about trolling, that there are examples of trolling that you might like to encourage, and there are examples of trolling that you might like to discourage. And if that's the case, then what do? How can we encourage what we want and discourage what we don't want? And as I'm going to get to in a little bit, how do we do that all and maintain free speech? So what are some possible top-down interventions that we could consider? We can consider things like platform redesign. When we're talking about Twitter and Facebook and the various things in the API and the way they can be manipulated. Sometimes people talk about just media literacy. I'm going to come back to that point. Recommendations for trust and verification of accounts, disrupting of economic incentives, banning accounts, maybe regulatory approaches, although most government bills I see that are labeled with one thing often do the exact opposite, so I get a little worried about that category. Or even just don't feed the trolls, strategic silence. We can also think about bottom-up interventions, doxing the trolls, shaming or trolling platforms and newsrooms, or also kind of peer-to-peer moderation techniques, white lists of good places for information, call-outs, counter memes or discursive patches like Godwin's Law, redirection of threads. Those are all examples of bottom-up interventions, and I don't think we have enough time tonight to really talk about each of those techniques. What I mostly want to do is, as Joan said, start everyone thinking about things we could do. And one thing I'd like to do is point you all to some of the amazing publications from Data and Society in this area. Things like navigating content moderation after fake news, the media manipulation report, the promised challenges and futures of media literacy, lexicon of lies, also searching for alternative facts, analyzing scriptural inference in conservative news practices, and the oxygen of amplification. So go check those out. Those are amazing publications, very much worth a read for people who are seriously searching for some possible strategies in this space. Tonight, I want to think about possibly the role of the troll. Are there things that gray hat and white hat trolls could be doing? Are there ways that people in this community could be helping on this front? Could we be doing more of informing media companies and platforms, which platforms are kind of media companies, even if they don't want to admit it, of vulnerabilities that are being exploited? Could we talk about the case studies of bad actors and their incentives that help media companies and platforms think about how they want to target their efforts? Could we do some more direct intervention, putting pressure on media companies to change their practices, more demonstrating attack vectors as proofs of concepts, more trolling of trolls? Those are all things to think about and things that have been discussed here at Hope in some venues. I would like to call out an example that I think is a really great one. Have you guys followed the ProPublica investigation of Facebook's platform and how it was that vulnerabilities in that platform allowed Facebook to be selling ads to Jew haters? You think, how in the world did that happen? I don't know if you've looked at the details of that, but if you think, how did that happen? It's simply that Facebook allowed users to enter their own occupation. They didn't occur to them that people would enter that. And then they allowed ads to be sold into that category. That's a great example of seeing how platform features could be misused, how socio-technical systems could be hacked to set a particular agenda, working with the platforms to change those features, and then publishing that in kind of a moment of media literacy. Another thing I really want to get to is how does this relate to free speech? And I've been thinking about this a lot after my year on sabbatical hanging out with the media manipulation team. I would say that I came into it from a kind of free speech marketplace of ideas, just let people talk and we'll all sort it out kind of thing. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is the opinion of many people in this community as well. How many people say, yes, I think that's kind of my opinion? It's hard for me to see hands, but I'm seeing some.
We just had that snatched hat.
Yeah, right.
Hat to wear.
Yeah. So here is one thing I'd like you to consider. Free speech with your one mouth and body. Sure, you have a right to that. Go knock yourself out. Say whatever you want, wherever you want. I will say you have a right to. I might judge you if I don't like what you say, but I will say you have every right to say it. But do you have a right to the amplification of that speech? Do you have the right to both your one mouth and body plus 20,000 bots to amplify what you just said? Do you have the right to your opinion plus a sock puppet account that pretends to be on the opposite side of what you think, where you make them look ridiculous? Do you have that? Do you have a right to that? And especially when you think about how one person's speech or amplified speech can drown out other people's speech, so as a kind of denial of service of other people's free speech, and also an attack on individuals' attention sovereignty. So how do we want to think about this as a slightly more nuanced space where it is not just about whether or not you have the right to speech? I would say yes, but do you have a right to the amplification of your speech? And that's where I am not as clear. And another thing I want to talk about is kind of this kind of marketplace of ideas, let everybody sort it out themselves. Is it really just a matter of media literacy? People should just be much more skeptical of all the things they read and run everything to ground. And the more I think about that, I think, do we really have the time and the mental space to be an investigative journalist? Do we have the ability to run to ground every claim we read? It's kind of that finite lifetime problem. We can't verify and investigate every claim. And there's the fundamental problem that inflammatory lies are often stickier and more profitable than the truth. So in this space, do we need some content moderation? Do we need some of those type of interventions that I would say at the beginning of the year I would have rejected out of hand, and I'm beginning to be a bit more sympathetic to? And any of this kind of platform moderation, content moderation, is a form of gatekeeping. It's basically saying what voices are going to be heard and what voices are not going to be heard. And I think gatekeeping undercounts voices. There are voices that are not going to be heard. And no moderation, no gatekeeping, the problem with that is it overcounts voices. It allows some voices to be over-amplified relative to what is appropriate. And if I think about just peer-to-peer gatekeeping or moderation strategies, I worry that that just tends to tribalism. If I don't want a centralized gatekeeping and I don't have the time or energy to do it myself, what am I going to do is I'm going to start to trust people like me. So I'm not sure that that is exactly the strategy I want either. And in the computer security space, I often find inspiration for cybersecurity, online security, by looking at the real world. And I say things like, if I was going to give my credit card to the waiter, and they were going to go off with it a while, do I really need to make it, any more secure than that online? I play games with that for myself. But in this environment, when I think about the attention and media landscape we've had for a long time, I just start to realize that it was pretty broken as it was. There were a lot of voices that weren't being heard. And it's not as simple as security is, in the sense that maybe, there's an owner of a resource and, you are protecting that. Our attention landscape is something that is fundamentally shared, and we need a new set of collective agreements about how we're going to divvy up that space. And I don't think we can just look to the way we used to do it offline and say, let's translate that into this new environment. So I think we have all been really actively grappling with what to do. What should be the rules for sharing our attention landscape? What kind of moderation and gatekeeping should we have? What kind of bottom-up strategies can we have? What kind of top-down strategies could we have? What should our long-term goals for this? What should our short-term changes be, given that many of our long-term goals don't seem very realizable at the moment, given what platform companies are willing to do or what governments are willing to do? And I mostly would like to end what we say to you on this note, but hope that it will spark a lot of conversation, maybe some good questions now, is that what I end up with in my head is that maybe I do want some gatekeeping, but not too much. Like, I certainly wouldn't want, only locked down verified accounts that go to individuals, because I want anonymity and I want lots of other things. So maybe some gatekeeping, but not too much, because cracks in things are where the light gets through. So I will leave it with that, and I hope it has sparked some ideas, and see, do we have any questions or opinions or suggestions? Anyone? There's a microphone in the middle aisle. I see some people headed back there. Awesome.
I'll do my best to keep an inflection on the end of this one. So I'm curious if you've studied at all the nature of habit formation, thinking in the light of like the BJ Fogg behavioral actionable model or Neary-Al's kind of habit loop, and the impact that might have on not necessarily the troll action in particular, but our reaction to the troll action.
So I don't do much cognitive psychology in terms of that, but what I take is a movements perspective, and I also think about the internet as a set of practices. And we've gotten really good, people who play basketball get really good at basketball, right? And so one of the things that when platform companies are seeing things and they call us and they say, what do you think is happening? Our products haven't ostensibly changed in the last 3 or 4 years, but everybody thinks all of our stuff is broken. And I explain that a lot of different groups of people have gotten really good at provoking those kinds of habitual reactions. And so there's a quote from Jordan Peterson where he says, I monetize social justice warriors. And that really got me thinking. I was like, yeah, you kind of have. When you need a boost in your Patreon or some money, you go online, you troll someone, and then you put your donation link in. It's classic, right? And so that habituation in the frame of sociology around strategies and tactics of social movements, it's very clear that we're dealing with tactical innovation, right? Which is that a tactic expires in time. Eventually the platform companies figure out how to mitigate against it, or communities figure out how to mitigate against it, or they innovate a new tactic. And so things like brigading are less effective now than they were a few years ago, because when you're getting, people were figured out how to share block lists, for instance. And so I do often think about the reciprocal nature of these things and how what's interesting to me too is that the platform companies often come down publicly on this notion of free speech, and we must protect, like, Holocaust deniers. That was a big one this week. We must protect Holocaust deniers, right? And so, to my mind, what's interesting is what they say is actually not what they do, which is that they do take down that stuff. They just don't tell you about it. And activists in this room know very well. Jillian York runs the online censorship database. They take down stuff all the time. And they do it because people flag it. And so but that reciprocal nature of the way in which people are forming habits and also responding in real time makes it really difficult to, one, break those habits, but then also they only really learn to coordinate when they feel personally threatened.
Cool. Next question. Yeah.
So thank you for the really interesting presentation. I had a question about gatekeeping. You talked a lot about sort of top-down models, the sort of authoritarian, the site host or service provider dictates what happens model, and a lot about bottom-up moderation of sort of the admins or the users directly moderate what's going on. And I worry, and I hear that sort of duality presented here. I hear it in a lot of other conversations about gatekeeping in online speech forums. And I worry that we're building this sort of false dichotomy where it's presented as a choice between tyranny and anarchy. I'm curious if you're aware of any projects sort of aiming for a democratized gatekeeping or some sort of more group decision-driven model of doing that kind of moderation.
I think the problem is that for a democratized approach, you have to be able to count votes, or you get the same problem of overcounting, right? Do I get 20,000 votes because I was smart enough to make 20,000 fake accounts that I control? How many votes do you get? So I think democratized approaches would have a lot of potential, but we have to figure out the voting problem, which I think, as Matt Blaze was saying yesterday, was an amazingly hard problem, one of the hardest technical problems he'd run into or something like that, which it's pretty hard.
Okay, but are you aware of any projects working on that?
Oh.
This goes back to like where people build it into the system. I think that there are like very successful Reddit communities that, on top of the moderation tools that they've been given, also have moderators meetings and actually use the socio-technical like methods of discussion. Wikipedia as well has like a lot of discussion built into the moderation, but that takes a lot of time. And these platforms, they are they scaled so fast they're literally trying to reverse engineer their own product to debug it right now. And so, but in terms of I haven't used Mastodon since like a beta test, and I don't know what it looks like now. But also the other idea is like what you're dealing with too isn't just like a problem of democracy, but a problem of density and scale. And a lot of it has to do with people gain a lot of power as they gain new ways to amplify or new ways of gaining an audience that is willing to act on their behalf. Of course, like we've gone so far through this panel without mentioning Milo, but Milo really turned his fan base into a swarm, and in doing so was able to really produce a lot of harm during Gamergate, et cetera. And so it's not answering your question, but it's really just saying that this is what's on the table here is how would we build it?
Yeah, one thing I think about a lot, increasingly like extending the kind of model of the media environment and being a security environment, is like thinking about it in terms of like threat modeling as well. One thing we think about a lot is what role the decline of community and local news services played, right? So, I mean, if you would think about it from a threat model sort of position, if your gatekeeper is someone that you know and someone that you trust and is part of a community that they have ties to, and you can kind of hold them accountable and you can really believe what they say, then they're maybe filtering out stuff that you trust them to filter out, right? And so I think if we were to take like a threat model approach to this, everyone's threat model is going to be different. Everyone's going to be affected by different types of information differently. Even if it's the same information, people are going to have different responses. So, I mean, for me, I think any solution to some of these problems we see are going to have to go back to imagining what communities are, and forms of democracy really rooted in community.
Thanks.
Hi, I have a question about how we can come together and actually agree on definitions and agree on what's reasonable. I'd like to read a tweet. If Trump does nothing else, he needs to replace retiring lefty justices with Scalias who understand that the Supreme's job is to protect the Constitution and rights. Ginsburg can't hold on forever, so fingers crossed. So this is a tweet that Stephen Rombaume sent March 27th of this year. He then came here and participated in the Q&A after Chelsea Manning's talk and floated a conspiracy theory that he had no evidence for, that she was involved or had given evidence against Julian Assange. And then he was given, he was able to expound on his conspiracy theory and all of his ideas for 3 hours. So there's this big split in Hope because all of this was after the hat incident.
I still need it, though.
So my question is, how does Hope create an environment that's very welcoming for people that wish death on their political enemies and people from the alt-right and vulnerable groups? Is there a way that we can come together and you can create a safe space for both sides? I think that's absurd, but maybe I'm being unreasonable. So tell me how we can come together, or tell me perhaps I'm being unreasonable, is my question.
Yeah, you're not being unreasonable. I think that ultimately one of the things that has to get put on the table is, to reverse the analog situation still here applies. Right? But a lot of people are depending upon organizers to organize the solution, and there was a lot of consternation and delay that has to do with actual in-person, face-to-face decision making is hard. And balancing those things is really hard, but it doesn't actually preclude anyone from also organizing their own community event in community response and holding those conversations within one of the villages or somewhere else, and making it clear that they're not going to participate in things until such time that in this instance, you have a few people that are really knowing that, they know what they're going to get when they push those buttons, right? You don't show up with, a hat on like that and expect everybody to be nice to you, right? And so it's
the person didn't just show up with a hat because he likes Trump. He showed up and was bragging that he went to the Unite the Right rally.
Yeah,
he was bragging that he was a Nazi. He was intimidating people.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that have complained to security and said that that no one responded to their criticisms, and so someone else confronted them, and that person was removed from the space. So it's not fair to say, oh, it's a guy walking around and he just so happens to be wearing a Trump hat, and it's just because that's how he felt that day. It's really dishonest to say that.
Yeah,
I would agree.
I completely disagree. I completely agree with you, and I also think that in instances where I've been organizing events or have been trolled in public, it's really hard to conjure the support that you would need to do the right thing, because there's a lot of arguing going on in the midst of that, and people end up falling on principles rather than acting in sympathy and support for the people who are actually being harmed, right? And so in instances like that, if I was in charge, of course, no platform, this isn't the place for that. But also I would really encourage people to continue those conversations and hold those conversations here.
So
where policies and those enforcement measures can be taken up and can be, sort of debugged and then rebuilt. Like I was at a meeting once where a bunch of people were sitting in a circle and they had all of their issues on the table, and someone held up a sign that said that they were the Aryan nation, right? Everybody else had the other signs that they were like the people of color caucus. And what happened was everybody just stood up and said, we're not going to keep doing this until you leave. And he got moved out of the room. There was no violence. But, crowds have power, but and they should use it in instances where it's disrupting participation.
So Stephen Rambam sent out a message like wishing death, like that he wanted Ginsburg to die soon because of her political beliefs. I'm sure he would say that he said that ironically, just like all of these other alt-right people. Is it reasonable for Hope to say we can accommodate him and we can accommodate alt-right disruptors that are trying to incite violence and marginalize people, or is that an unreasonable goal that you can tolerate and be welcoming to both?
Yeah, well, Matt just finished, not to put you on the spot, but Matt just finished a paper that he had been writing and researching about how irony is used to hedge against people understanding what the intent is, and this is kind of a troll's bet. That it will cause more energy to be spent on their issues than it would be to just kick out the individual and then move on with the event.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I don't know. I mean, there's one question of intentionality. I've been following this on Twitter. I see some people, debating whether this is a troll or whether he's someone who's intentionally coming into this space to make people feel uncomfortable. Is he a troll or is he an abuser? And I think you can spend a lot of time debating these kinds of questions because the amount of information we don't have is significant, right? But to Joan's point, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't exactly know what to do in this case. I'm not privy to Hope's conversation, but I do imagine, there's things that conference organizers can do, and then there's things that people can do. People can in theory organize to normatively engage, right? And that can take different forms. Does that mean symbolically showing your support for your peers and making it clear that in discourse you do not stand for this sort of thing, or does it mean escalating it to another level? Who's at the table when those decisions are made? I'm not a huge member of this community, so I don't know all of the issues involved. I know what I would do if I was in a community that was very important to me. But I don't know what the mechanisms here are. And do other people, who do we put this question to?
I'd like to try out this idea of the right to free speech versus the right to amplification of that speech. So I would feel differently about someone walking around with a hat saying whatever they wanted with their one mouth, body, and hat. But when they're using the mic to ask questions, or when they're given a presentation slot, I start to feel differently, because that is a clear amplification of that one view. And so I think I would not disrupt a single individual wearing a hat or speaking with their one mouth and body. I might not choose to stay and listen to them. I might judge them for the thing they said, but I would take a stand against the amplification.
I think that's what people here want to put on the table tomorrow. Not to point out Carolyn Cinders, but my friend and ally here is going to also be talking about these issues tomorrow. And I think it's actually a conversation that needs to keep coming up in the planning process for years to come, because ultimately everything that people are saying and doing, especially around the socio-technical, is becoming very, very politicized. And I'm a freaker. Like, I like tinkering. I like touching things. I like making them do things that they aren't supposed to do. And I feel that tension here with people who want to get back into that sort of scientific-y, apolitical space of being like, what does it mean to build, radios again, to have like low power to the people. And so I think that like making sure that those events and those things can still go on in the midst of someone trying to troll the event itself is like the greatest aspiration of organizers. And again, like I don't speak for Hope. I didn't participate in the planning, but I think that like that is definitely something that is an important value that will be carried through to the next Hope. And in tomorrow, I hope you all go and listen to the ways in which Caroline has been working on these issues for the last couple of years.
Thank you. We're over our time. Thank you very much. I'm sorry there aren't enough questions, but I'm sure they'll take questions outside the room if they have time. Thank you. This conversation will be continued.